say by way of introduction that there are some leaflets at the back that tell you a little bit about the kind of courses and modules and opportunities for study there are here at the City Centre. Please do take them away. If you've never thought about study before, then I think this is a great place to try it out. You will be welcome, and there's full details there. You can contact registry in particular to find out more, and we will be delighted to let you know about the opportunities here and see whether there's something that would give you reason to come and join us and be part of our learning. Our main purpose this evening is to launch a book. In case you've not heard about it. Graham Adams is one of our tutors here at Luther King Centre. Graham teaches in mission studies, world Christianity, and religious diversity. He has the longest title of anyone. And Graham has recently written, and it's now published, this book, Holy Anarchy, an alternative term for God's kingdom that he picks up, a term coined, I think, by Andrew Shanks himself, and Graham picks it up and explores its meaning and purpose. Graham, you are a valued member of this community. You really are. A valued member of the staff team here. Graham, we find, is someone who is invariably creative, insightful, often pushing us to think in new ways, and forever telling us to be shaken. Shaking us, a big theme that comes out in the book, and Graham is constantly reminding us to read that. So it's a real joy for us here at LKC to have this book launch and be able to affirm the work, the study and the learning that Graham offers in our midst here. And we're delighted too that David is here. David Sherrington is from SCM Press, and David is the one who's had to cope with Graham's journey into print. David, did you want to come and say a few words? We're going to be a little bit more formal than we sometimes are because of the need to record and also the link with Anthony Reading in due course. So David, if you've got anything you want to say about Graham that we don't know already.
I will attempt to be formal. I'm not sure it's my natural way, but anyway, just as my welcome to that of Graham. My role is I'm the associate publisher at SCM Press, so I just put the words on other people's, the covers on other people's words, so you did it the wrong way around there. Very convicting. SCM, we're a kind of publisher that I guess our focus is around believing that theology can engage with the questions that church and society are asking, and can be a subversive and a liberative thing, and be relevant, and sometimes even speak truth to power. And I guess that all sort of fits its kind of enter Holy Anarchy, which by the way is a great book title, because it means that we're launching Holy Anarchy this evening, which is a fabulously exciting thing to be doing. Who knew Holy Anarchy was launched today? I first engaged with Graham, I think it was SST, the big Society of Study Theology conference that happens every year. And I just had a look over emails, and I realised that the first exchange is me saying, I'm really sorry I haven't got back to you. So that was a great start. But I'm grateful for Graham's forbearance through the process. It's quite a process writing a book. There's a lot of, it's a bit of a roller coaster, I think. And there's the sense I always get is that authors kind of have to live with the book over time. And sometimes it feels like it's almost too close. Sometimes it feels like it's a long way away at arm's length, and it's just a sort of interesting relationship you have with the book. But thank you, Graham, for your forbearance through the process, and eventually for letting go, because that's very hard. It's hard to let go of the book when you're an author. And you get that sense when an author says, I I finished it, but can you just give me a little longer? Can you just give me a little longer? And sometimes you have to sort of wrench it back. I want the book. So, yeah, so thank you, Graham, for eventually letting go. It's a measure of a book, one measure of a book, anyway, is the enthusiasm with which endorsers take up the opportunity to talk about it. And I've got lots of enthusiastic yes when I approach people to endorse the book. So we had Eve Parker, who is now at USPG, and she calls it timely and critical. And Graham and Michael Jagassar calls it brilliant, necessary, and timely. Timely is a word that comes up a lot when we talk about books, so that's good. But that also means that because it's timely, you have to buy it now. And I have copies over here, and it's normally $19.99, but I'll do it for you for $15.99 this evening. So do come by. I've got a card machine, and I'm sat in a corner. But that's enough.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. So, just so you know, our pattern for this evening, in a moment, Graham is going to introduce the book to us, those of us who've not yet read it, to share with us something of the arguments and thoughts that he develops within the book, and then we're going to have two responses. Firstly, from Kate Gray, and then from Anthony Reddy. And after they have both spoken, there may be a little exchange between Graham himself and both of those who are responding to him, and then we'll have a time for comment and questions and discussion together before we plan to finish about 9. Basic pattern of this evening. So Graham, I think with the help of some PowerPoint slides, you will introduce to us Holy Anarchy.
Thanks, Graham. So the first thing to do is to say thank you to all of you for coming. It's really special to be able to share this evening with you. And thank you to Graham for his encouragement over X number of years, and for not minding when I call him the other Graham. And to everyone who helped make this event happen, thank you especially of Adam with all the technicalities we've been dealing with this evening. And to David, for your encouragement and as you thank me for my forbearance, ditto, and all SEM, an amazing team of people. And I really like what you said about the book being both close and far away. That captures really well Holy Anarchy as well, with that sense of which it is something in our grasp and yet also a horizon. And that's a thing that I think we'll keep coming back to. And sort of letting go of it and then seeking it. And of course, there are so many people to thank because it takes a village to raise a book, as you all know. So thank you to all my colleagues here who have put up with me banging on about particular things that's going into this now. Sometimes asking wise questions, and being sometimes asking wise questions, and being encouraging. You're basically a brilliant bunch of colleagues, mostly.
Amen.
And to the students here who've been brave guinea pigs while I've experimented with various ideas, but thankfully guinea pigs who answer back with their pushing and probing and even urging me to develop my own voice in all of this, which they may come to regret. And to those people who've given particular sorts of support through this process, Janet and Bob, who are here this evening as we shared walks through my sabbatical or spiritual misdirection, as we call it, in discussion about the chapters as they unfolded. And others who read various parts of it, Claire and my good comrade Noel, and those who endorsed the book, Michael Jagassar, Eve Parker, and Esther McIntosh, and Anthony Reddy, who wrote an amazing foreword which somehow captured what I hoped I was doing, but I was never quite sure if I was. And to various cheerleaders, like Kate here this evening, helping me be a little bit more extrovert than I intended. Feeling that. Thank you, too, to Andrew Shanks, whose name has been mentioned, the theologian who first used the term Holy Anarchy to redescribe the kingdom of God, and whose ideas have been hugely influential on me, and I'm particularly grateful to him that he didn't have the wisdom to use the term in his own book titles. Leaving space for me, because as David hinted, it is quite catchy, isn't it? And of course, to my family, to Cheryl and to Bethan, who, as I say in the book, have generously tolerated the anarchy around me, even if that's not what I meant to do, and helps to love this into being. Anyway, I'm guessing you don't want an Oscar speech, but to know a little bit about the book, so here's a sense of the overall story. Holy Anarchy. It's a book about the kingdom of God, as Graham said, but re-expressed as Holy Anarchy because of issues with the idea of kingdom, while arguing for an alternative way of being true to the original intentions. Basically, I think there are three ways in which Holy Anarchy is a good alternative way of capturing the idea of this strange new world which Jesus declared. Firstly, and this is the sense in which Andrew Shanks specifically means it, it's about a realm without archy, no ruling over, no domination. It's even subversive of any archy. It's anti-domination. And crucially, this is both about humans not dominating, but also about God not dominating. Because the nature of God and God's action in the world is not about control, but about solidarity in the midst. So firstly, the kingdom is actually an anti-kingdom, as some have suggested, precisely because it is an anarchic realm, an event in which domineering power of any kind is subverted. Secondly, it's no coincidence that anarchy is often linked with chaos. That connection is often made to frighten us, but actually we should be more frightened by false order. The settled systems of our world are defined in so many ways by domination. They hold us in some sort of order, but it's often not good order. There may be one or two examples you can think of right now. So what is needed is some chaos, unsettling, shaking, disturbance, disruption, or holy anarchy, the event of messing things up a bit, crack the fortresses of power, whether in economics or race or gender or sexuality or disability or age, all the things that keep us closed off from one another, that keep us unneighbourly, unempathetic, creating space in which new possibilities can emerge. So holy anarchy is an ongoing process. It is the way as well as the goal. And so thirdly, its ambiguity is important. Maybe we intuitively know this about the kingdom which Jesus proclaimed, that it's elusive, it's hard to pinpoint, it's found in unexpected places and people, defying assumptions, not least our insider assumptions, when we presume to be the people who get it. Because actually, and maybe the term holy anarchy reflects this more easily than the kingdom of God, which sounds all too boundary. The thing is that it cuts across other existing loyalties, being present amongst them, yes, even them, even as it seems to be absent amongst us. But somehow, because it distracts us from what we expect and wriggles through the cracks in our walls and finds common cause amongst people who shouldn't agree, it actually has this strange capacity, this strange power to build solidarity amongst all sorts, to be the basis of a solidarity of solidarities. So these, I think, are three integral characteristics of holy anarchy. An event that is always against domination of any kind, a process of a certain sort of chaos, messing with prevailing systems in pursuit of renewal, and an ambiguity, slipping through our grasp, cutting across loyalties to build new solidarities. That's the overall feel of the story, and I wish I summarised it quite like that in the book. But I imagine you might find it helpful to have an overview of the chapters to see how the argument comes together. So part one introduces the organising principle, holy anarchy, recognising there are other options for re-expressing God's kingdom, but arguing for this one in particular because if it's a kingdom like no other kingdom, that's because it is the very opposite of a domineering realm. So in the first chapter, I also recognise there's something ambiguous about it. It may mean this, but at the same time, insiders are always the best people to express or demonstrate it. It is to be found in unexpected places, a fleeting glimpse in our peripheral vision, an exclamation mark taking us by surprise, as well as subtly waiting in the cracks in the system, too small to be held. It was necessarily both present and elusive, and urges us to be open to others who can teach us about it. I root this in the approach to a theology which we explore here, how contexts themselves aren't neat and tidy, how the work of Andrew Shanks helped me to see the importance of being shaken out of our preconceptions and taken for grantedness, and my involvement with a global mission partnership, the Council of the World Mission, helps me to name the big structures which impede this process, and how these questions are connected with me personally. In Chapter 2, I explore why there are such different Christianities, particularly in terms of this question of domination, starting with a reflection on the American insurrection of 6th January 2021, and what was going on when so many who were present at that were self-declared Christians, contrasting this with the pursuit of holy anarchy. So how can Christianity be so conflicted? I suggest the answer has to do with two kinds of truth, which Shanks identified, but I rework a little. Truth in hand is grasped truth, edited truth, what we hold, often impatiently, but also with a degree of necessity. After all, we need to work with distinctions between this as opposed to that. It's an essential way of making some sense of the world, identifying common ground between those who think the same. It helps us define things and reject other things. It helps us have a sense of order and control. But crucially, it's always about editing. Truth in process, on the other hand, is about an attentiveness to the inadequacy of truth in hand, an alertness to the way things are connected to other things, for better or for worse. In other words, while truth in hand effectively uses lines to separate things, like a closed fist with its boundary, truth in process instead uses lines to connect them, like an open palm, alert and receptive to all the connections, all the dissonances, the contradictions, the tensions, the possibilities. So it is the greater truth, but one that we often marginalise, because it is so demanding and awkward. And this tension between these two kinds of truth obviously informs our understanding of the gospel. While there are clearly bits of our faith which are more like truth in hand, which define the distinctive marks of our tradition, this bit of data as opposed to that. Ultimately, these things point us to the open-handedness of divine love. Love which attends hospitably to us with all our connections and tensions, our pain and potential. Love which is neighbourly towards us, even though we are often more closed-fisted. So the higher truth of the gospel is more like truth in process, at least the prioritising of it. Its neighbourliness, hospitality, grace, in fact, are intrinsically open-handed. But in one way or another, we are more inclined to reduce the gospel to something more like truth in hand and edited love. I explore how this tension is worked out in relation to different emphases, whether we focus on correct belief, or on grace itself, or on the pursuits of justice. The thing is, grace and justice must work together. So we need the tension between two kinds of truth, where the truth in process of divine love is ever open to us all, an expansive, generous, hospitable grace. And then it always has a critical edge, simultaneously exposing that we are close to one another, illuminating our ungraciousness, our denial of others' dignity, the asymmetries in power which cause injustice. So we need the open-handed love of God and the critical edge of divine justice, transform domination. As examples, I work this through in terms of the two issues of racism and our ecological crisis. Truth in hand tends to prevail, and the damaging consequences of it, in human terms and ecologically. So part one then lays some groundwork, holy anarchy being rooted in open-palmed neighbourliness, the possibility of connection across all sorts of other loyalty, but which is resisted by forces which would close us down. So then part two turns to the first of the dimensions which resist holy anarchy, the most powerful dimension, the very structures and systems of our world which are dominating. In chapter 3, I explore how these systems aren't only external to us in politics and economics and so on, but are also internal within us, because our psyches, our imaginations, our religious commitments, as well as our social world, form and feed each other, as we give greater weight to the power of a certain truth in hand, the presumption that there are no alternatives, going with the flow of this is just the way of the world, resigning ourselves to the imbalances and the asymmetries between us. I explore these structures particularly in terms of the language of empire, or structures of dominion, the systems which colonize us, which make us feel that certain patterns of human power are normal, which are promoted through propaganda, and how this infects not only politics but religion. So our consciousness is colonized, our sense of what it is to be human, our economy and our thought and our theology. But we are never entirely colonized. There is a little bit of space for breathing and imagining and acting. So in contrast, the ways of God are undomesticated, not contained by those forces. To see this is to begin with our imagination, which even finds itself limited according to structures of domination or empire. But there's always an untamed part of us, prompted by the untamed God, who re-sparks our imagination to help us see that there are several alternatives, an insight gained from post-colonial perspectives, pushing against the so-called inevitability of empire. A little extract which captures this tension. It is as though there is a tension between different visions of the house. The imperial vision is nicely groomed, neat and tidy, everything has its place, the borders are defined, and the functions of each room are well known. There's little space for anything poetic, anything that might push ambiguously or subversively against such a vision, except that it fosters sentimentality in us, nostalgia from edited time when we all, in inverted commas, lived in safety. So it is only a poetry of cliché, of purity, and manicured beauty. It is a house in which certain people know how to live well, whereas many others would feel lost, ill at ease, alien. Meanwhile, there is another vision of a house or a household which is less domesticated, more unruly, a wilder space, where an unexpected coalition of people make their home, not easily, not without tension, and sometimes moving the walls, redesigning the architecture, reframing the space to make room for newcomers. It is a house or a home which does not define its borders too closely, because the tenants, or they may be the owners, no one quite knows, recognise how interdependent they are on the wider environment, where roots and streams and clouds intermingle. It is a vision which is undomesticated, always pushing against its containment within more restrictive patterns of living, allowing room for the untamed God to erupt through the cracks. And in chapter 4, I developed this decolonising approach, which is about decolonising our imagination, our consciousness, but also our unconsciousness, recognising that we've been colonised more than we realise. And through beginning to see this, we can reimagine an alternative anti-empire, or kingdom, or holy anarchy, a kingdom of chaos, which is connected with chaos theory, the potential for something as small as a butterfly to effect significant transformation, or something as small as a child, of the child, whose power is not controlling, but possibilizing, with open hand, illuminating the reality of empire and making connection and solidarity possible in its midst. This approach is the basis of a reworking of the 5 marks of mission. So first, hearing the groans of creation caused by the patterns of empire, exposing and transforming them. Hearing the cries of the oppressed caused by the patterns of empire, exposing and transforming them. Tending the needs of those bruised by such systems. Building alternative communities of those disentangling themselves from empire. And proclaiming the good news of empire subversion at the hands of God's awesome weakness. These may also be expressed in terms of what I call uncivilized habits. The wild marks of mission, as I put it, being untamed rather than respectable. For the church, called to be a sign, foretaste, and agent of holy anarchy, there will always be a degree of wildness in our DNA. Even if the impetus for this impertinence is the apparent fragility of an open palm. After all, if we are to expose the structures of oppression, exploitation, and exclusion in which we are embedded, we will not always be popular. But the wildness that runs through our calling involves the discipline of discernment, drawing on the resources of our faith to help us identify the very structures that do not want to be exposed. The market myths, the scapegoating of the poor and the refugees, the claim that hard work alone will lift people out of poverty. Such lies need exposing, even if this defines us as wild. In part 3, I turn to the church in particular, in light of those desires to transform the big systems and structures. What does it mean to be an alternative community? While recognising that we can't deny our own contamination. We're part of the problem as well as part of the solution. And we need to be honest about this. After all, Jesus broke a convention about purity and impurity, being found with the impure and upsetting the pure. So we too can be and are called to be immersed in places of impurity. This calls us to affirm the agency of others, that is, those taught by empire that they have little to contribute. They become the ones with much to teach us. And in our childlikeness, we don't have the power or even the articulacy to solve it all. Rather, we are in process together with God. Unfinished as we are, but in motion, however slowly. And we must lament, not only as Easter people in a Good Friday world, but as Good Friday people in a world that often rushes towards Easter. And our engagement with Scripture helps us to give priority to those voices which open us up to the world in all its fullness and awkwardness and pain, while also understanding why other voices close us down. Chapter 6 develops this, the church as the awkward body of Christ, an anarchic church, holy and messy, religious and spiritual, prayerful and playful, mediating between many different voices and experiences, while also agitating in the face of structures or habits which try to hold people in their place. Part 4 asks the question, are we the only people doing this, or are others also being opened up, shaken to the call of holy anarchy? Even if they have different language for it, different emphases within it, and even if it's concealed or suppressed by other effects of the domination system. In chapter 7, on the basis that faith is also faithfulness, I suggest Jesus was himself faithful to, shapen by, loyal to holy anarchy. And he showed how it cuts across loyalties, finding its home in all sorts of places. This makes us think a bit differently about uniqueness, our uniqueness in others, and the challenge to be xenophile, that is, loving towards that which is strange to us. While also appreciating that it's not about endorsing everything, because even as holy anarchy is present in many places, its negation is also widespread. So like the open palm, we find common cause, but remain alert to asymmetries of power and the unneighbourliness and injustice in religion and politics. Then in chapter 8, I consider the strangeness that we're introduced to in worship. This strange new world, holy anarchy, which knocks on the glass, through which we see dimly, which invites us to a dance lesson, to dance to new rhythms, which we struggle to learn. That we hold together our failures with forgiveness, we gather up the fragments of what we do and bring and dream of, serve to step into the new world. Even as we're held back, we walk in two worlds. Then in the conclusion, I draw some of these things together, revisiting the gospel of awesome weakness, affirming how anarchy can sometimes be anonymous in unlikely places, affirming the weight of small things, that is, how every small contribution to holy anarchy generally witnesses to this alternative possibility. But we can often feel a bit stuck. Our words aren't good enough for capturing it. So perhaps we should say nothing to anyone, for fear that it will come back and bite us. But actually, like the women at the tomb, we are witnesses to something new which beckons us. What will we do?
Thank you, Graham, leaving us with quite a question to reflect on. Thanks. Thank you. So good to have you with us. If I'm right, you're minister in the United Reformed Church and currently engaged in some research yourself around issues of poverty. University, is it? Yes. Thank you. You're going to respond to Graham and what he's written and shared with us.
I'm here as a cheerleader, but I haven't quite got the outfit. So, thank you, Graham, for this book. I found it easy to read and very disturbing. I loved it because it annoyed me. Thanks for that. Full stop. No, couple more moments. It was full of things that made me think. It made me reconsider all aspects of the way that I grip very, very tightly sometimes to the truth in my closed, grippy, sweaty hand, and my mind, and my heart. I found just the structure of the organisation of the book really helpful. It's an academic book with academic ideas, and it doesn't sound too off-putting. The way that you are cleverly communicating with the readers, you had in mind, I do not know who when you wrote this. I'd be interested in the readers, because we're not a homogenous group of people, are we? The variety of approaches was very interesting. It's lively theology, done in a really robust way, and you use words not as barriers, but as doors. You talk about yourself, you share stories. These things seem understandable to me and the people I live and work amongst. That means it's even more academic, in my opinion. It does the hard work for those that are very welcome of it. I especially enjoyed, starting right at the back, the gloopy theology and worship praxis. I enjoy messy worship, being from the urban context that I live and work. And I appreciated very much the way in which you take the concept from Andrew Shanks and you develop that in a way that helped us unravel a bit more who we are and who our churches are and what kind of nonsense and claptrap we peddle sometimes. I met about a month ago with a community worker in Wythenshawe. We asked each other how we were doing, and then we spoke honestly about that. I said I was furious, although I had an incongruous smile on my face whilst I said that. I asked her how she was doing. She said, when I meet people and they say they're fine and they're doing okay, I wonder what's the matter with them. And then I can't be honest with them. That's what she said. And then it made me think some more about parts of this book that made me so uncomfortable. Some of them I found them repulsive. And that's really hard to say, and it's really hard to keep on reading about. Therefore, what to do with that? Yes, definitely awkward. Yes, definitely agitating. I remembered meeting some people a little while ago when my sister and I went to Italy. We were greeting and welcoming and resisting the G8 visitors to Italy. We met a little group of people who were completely masked. It was in the one like before, where masks were different. They completely covered their faces, except for their eyes, and they had in their hands hammers, and they stood around a BMW. And I thought about this chapter, quite early on, 3 into 4, about domination and smashing up the powers that be and that exist. My sister and I, we're quite different from each other, and we debated at the side of the road whether we would go and say hello, stop, encounter, greet in some way the anarchist bloc that was part of the protests. What is it that we would do and why? I wondered when I read this book, what were my pictures and snapshots of holy anarchy around me that I had either resisted and moved away from because I couldn't manage them? What were the ones that I was drawn to? And so I love your images, although they continue to unsettle me. The untamed God, the child God, the unfinished God, the unfitting God, the stranger God, and the horizontal God. They speak to the process theology that I love and unhandily can't cling on to. Theologically, it makes no sense to do that. And I really enjoyed the way in which you explore the 5 marks of sort of mission, anti-imperial, resistance and creativity. These are highly necessary in my view and really stood out for me as part of the work that I want to do more with this book, wherever I am. I loved number 1 and number 3 the most, hearing the groans of creation and the damage done, and to expose, subvert and transform those patterns. I heard echoes of Bonhoeffer's costly discipleship, even though I don't like redemptive models of substitutionary and propitiatory, long-worded kinds of salvation and discipleship and atonement models. These seem to me completely unfitting. So I'm glad you didn't use those words in the book. I think about the people who are in prison at the moment, trying to push some of those structures to encourage the legal system to be transformed in the face of climate catastrophe and prosecute some other people instead. But then I realise that's another ring, so that's a tricky thing, and I have to love my enemies, unfortunately. Then number 3, I'm wearing a little thread here, a little woolen thread. And the people that I went on pilgrimage with, the Church Action on Poverty gave it to me early on summer. This is a thread that runs through the book. How to be anti particular kinds of domination systems of empire and to love people. And I don't manage that very well. In the community I'm part of, we only do it sporadically and very inconsistently. And really, we don't always manage to tell the full truth about that. Which kind of truth? Both kinds, this hand or that hand. When I think about attending to the needs, this is number 3 in the list of 5 anti-Mark submission remarks, attending to the needs of people bruised and harmed by systems of systemic violence that I think are present in the state, the welfare system and the so-called benefit system. I think about the unmasking of empire that parades itself readily to feed whenever somebody applies for particular kinds of PIP or EHCP or any other off-putting letters that might put barriers in people's way. It made me think about chapter 3 and 4 particularly, and how to subvert the application, how to live where money is needed. And the question, how to join in as a Christian, or as anybody, and with anybody, and how to direct myself. But I wanted to think about this word that you use, attention, how to attend the needs, to attend, how to direct myself. So it could mean how to be subject to, how to stretch towards people. This thin string that I'm wearing of wool. Word attention, what we give our attention to and who and how really shapes our life, I think. The thread that runs through this book is about how I attend to the God or the strange system that you parade as God, and how to unmask that, and how to unfit and decolonize my mind and community, where that may be highly unwelcome, and we might be bothered because of it. There's an amazing poem, which I'm not going to read because it's too long, but it's called Sometimes a Wild God. Wild is a really on-trend word. It's in loads of books at the moment. It's doing the rounds. But still, it's been around a while, this concept. And I was thinking a little bit more about the wildness in particular kinds of pedagogy, or the nursery that I work in, and also about the wildness in a gentleness in the face of such fierce violence by the state done to people. I wanted to consider then an ecology of wildness, a kind of creative exposition, if you will, a practice of subversion with any old people. May the small ones rise. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the way you've worked with Graham's book and his thoughts and brought out your own language and offered us insights. Thank you. We're hoping we have Anthony there. Anthony, welcome. I'm looking forward to your own response to Graham's book. Anthony comes to us, is speaking to us, I assume, from Oxford this evening, where Anthony is the director of the Centre for Religion and Culture in Oxford and a leading scholar in the field of Black theology. And as Graham indicated earlier, Anthony was written the foreword to the book. Anthony, we'd be glad if you could speak to us and share with us.
Yes, it's my absolute pleasure to be with you, albeit remotely. I'm actually from Birmingham. I speak from Birmingham at the moment. I still live in Birmingham, but I work in Oxford, but I'm here in Moseley, Birmingham. I think first to say it was an absolute thrill to receive I think it was the sort of still a relatively rough manuscript that was sort of sent to me by Graham several months ago saying, would I be kind enough to write a foreword? So I remember reading through it and thinking to myself that this is a book that I have waited about 30 years to see. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And so for me, it was an absolute delight to be able to read it ahead of time, read it before many others, and to be able to make a few comments about it. And I'm pleased that Graham is pleased with the foreword. It was something that I gave a great deal of thought to, because the book was one that I read and have reread, and it has stayed with me really ever since. But actually, what I would like to do is to share a very quick story, because I think this, in many respects, speaks to the very heart of what I think will be a hugely influential book in many years to come. There's a story that goes back, it comes out of the Black liberation struggle in South Africa. And the story has many different iterations. The version I heard was told by one of the great Black liberation theologians in South Africa, a guy called Itumeleng Masala, but there are other versions of the same story. And the key thing to bear in mind that this is the days before mobile phones, before there were ways of communicating with people outside of the kind of standard sort of trunk line telephones in people's houses or in phone boxes. So there are two couples who are about to go on holiday, and they're going to spend 2 weeks together in this new resort, although they'll be separated by a week. So the first couple will go out for a week, second couple will join them after the second week. Then the other couple will then leave after they've done their 2 weeks, leaving the other couple to do their final week alone. So the first couple go and they go to the resort. And in the brochures, it's been hyped. It's going to be fantastic. There's great amenities. There's fantastic views. They can't wait. They pay their money. They arrive. And when they get into the resort, they find it's not finished. It's nothing like how it's been described in the brochures. But most perturbingly, and this is no disrespect to pigs, and the smell is atrocious, and the couple are offended. They're just beside themselves with anger because they've spent a lot of money. They've been looking forward to this holiday for so long, and they don't know what to do. The husband is incandescent with rage, and he wants to take the very prophetic, radical position of just leaving. He says, honey, we paid our money, I know, but this smell is appalling. I don't think we can stay here for 1 minute longer. We simply have to leave. The wife's a bit more pragmatic, and she says, but darling, we've paid our money, we're here now. Let's make the best of it. I mean, I know it's terrible, but, and besides which, if we leave now, we have no way of contacting the second couple, and they will arrive expecting to see us, and when we're not here, that's going to create all kind of confusion. Let's just give it our best shot. So they agree to, as they would say in Jamaican speak, they'll tough it out. They'll just give it their best shot. After a week, the second couple arrives. They arrive. They are transported to the resort, and they have exactly the same experience and thoughts as the first couple. The smell, it assaults their senses. And so the second couple turn to the first couple and they say, how on earth have you put up with this for a week? The smell is awful. How have you done it? And the first couple turn to the second couple and say, smell, what smell? And the point of the story in every iteration I've heard, but in terms of Masala's version was, what tends to happen, he says, is that when we get habituated to forms of injustice, systemic forms of injustice, it suddenly becomes so part of the atmosphere, part of our reality, that we no longer sense or see anymore. And Masala uses that particularly as a metaphor. I say, well, that's what happens, it says, with many white people in South Africa, it says, in the context in which I heard that story. He says, it's too easy to look at the extremists. It's too easy to look at the people who are filled with hate and are now violent and palpably violent to others. Because obviously, he says, they are the ones that capture our thoughts and imaginations. He says, but they're always a minority. The real people we have to challenge, he says, are all the ordinary individuals, the ones who are never going to lynch or murder someone else, the ones who just quietly go along with the system. They become habituated to it, that they don't see it, they don't see what's wrong, their consciences are rarely pricked, and they go about their business just being dutiful, law-abiding individuals. And he says, and the church are often the worst culprits for this, because what we then have, he says, is a form of dominion theology that sanctifies this. So even if someone were to turn around and say, but wait a minute, can't you smell the noxious odor in which we are living? The first thing that priests will do is to say that this is of God. I tell that story because I nearly kind of used it in the forward, but I decided I would use something else instead, only because this is a story that's kind of done the rounds and I didn't want to use a hackneyed third-hand version for what is a brilliantly original book. So I invented something for myself. And so if you haven't read the book, you'll read my forward. Obviously, it's not as good as the rest of the book. But even so, it is an attempt to try and capture, I think, what is the brilliant, elusive way in which Graham has developed his ideas of Holy Anarchy. But I think the central power of the book, for me, linking it to this story, is the sense in which what Graham has done as a gift for many of us, is to help us to be more greatly attuned to the fact that in the midst of what we have been told is normality, that we've been told is somehow the best of all worlds, it's a lie, and that there is a noxious smell that has stained our being, that exists in interlocking fashions, whether it's racism or environmental justice or sexism or homophobia and heteronormativity, whether it's classism and it's rampant neo-colonial capitalism. However we name it, Graham's gift has been able to say to us, this is something that we need to be aware of, that you can't even begin to think of changing something until you have new metaphors and new ways of being able to rename reality and to accept and to acknowledge that there's been a gross distortion in how we have been socialized as human beings over the last 1,500 years or so. That the embeddedness of empire, into which the church has pretty much largely colluded, with a few notable exceptions at various points in history, that Graham wonderfully points out and says, actually, there's always been this dual character to Christianity. For the most part, it has become habituated to and has become part of the problem itself. And yet there's always been that prophetic edge, that sense of a minority voice that has been able to say, this is not right. This is not the kingdom. There are alternative pictures and images, alternative ways of naming that in which we are all embedded. And the task of faithful people, not just within the ecclesia, not just within church, but beyond it, that challenges to work in solidarity as a means of trying to offer resistance, sometimes just small, pointed examples that seem quite fragile in themselves, and yet they have the potential to mushroom and grow. I think what struck me as I read the book Holy Anarchy was try to imagine myself being back in the first century as part of that fledgling Jesus movement. And I bet if you're a better person as a car-carrying Methodist, I've brought up not to drink and to smoke or to gamble. I managed to resist two of those. not like myself as just one of those. I don't gamble by, but actually I don't smoke either. Actually, I'm making a big deal of this whole conversation here. So ignore that aspect. Essentially, as one who has not been prone to gambling, I wonder how many people in that first century could have imagined that this fledgling movement of people following an itinerant rabbi from Nazareth would outlast the mighty kingdom of Rome. I bet there'd be very few takers, even the disciples themselves, and part of that wider early church movement could not have imagined that that to which they had been enabled to bear witness would one day outlast the rich Pax Romana. And so that's the good news. That's what I believe Graham is trying to get us to think about. And as I said at the outset, it's a book I've waited for over 30 years for. And the reason why is because what Graham does is that, and it takes enormous skill to be able to differentiate between all of us being caught up in something. We are all caught up in this mess. We are all caught up in this mass deceptive lie called reality that we have been convinced and asked to give assent to, that somehow it is analogous to God's kingdom. All of us are caught up in it. But we're not caught up in it equally to the point whereby there are not important aspects of responsibility that lie with particular groups more so than others. I remember the days before I became a theologian, I was a local authority trainer. I used to do anti-oppressive practice. And I started in Bradford, where I was born, soon after leaving university in 87, and then continued that work back in Birmingham in the late 80s and early 90s. And I remember going to a conference in Celio in 1990 in Birmingham, South Birmingham. And we were looking at anti-oppressive practice. And I remember the trainer was a very, very radical left-wing socialist/Marxist, who got us to think very critically about the system and the way in which oppressive practice impacts upon lots of different people. I remember sitting there as the only black person in the conference, wondering why it was that in a meeting in which I had very little agency as someone who was only 21 years old, alongside very, very experienced social workers, trainers, and community workers, people who had long been involved in anti-racist, anti-fascist work, yet there was never anything that deconstructed the fact that some people benefited a lot more from this oppressive system than others did. And so in a meeting that was overwhelmingly white, but overwhelmingly run by men and run by cis heterosexual men, none of those things were ever named. So I remember going home from the conference, at one level feeling that I belonged to something. I was someone who was always interested in these kind of ideas. Those of you who have heard me speak before will know that I'm named after Tony Benn, so that's a matter of great pride. So I was always someone who was interested in fellow travellers who were broadly committed to progressive ways of thinking around deconstructing capitalism and deconstructing classism and privilege, yet without ever an honest assessment that although all of us are caught up in it, we're not all of us equally privileged by the existing status quo of those systems that don't treat us equally, but yet in the classic dictum from Animal Farm, some people are still inherently more equal than others. And theology has been no better. In fact, it's been probably worse than a lot of critical theory in terms of the work that comes out of sociology and cultural studies. So as I said, I've kind of waited almost 30 years to find a white British male writer who could be honest enough to say, as we are critiquing and deconstructing systems, let's also be honest about the way in which different subjectivities live within those systems, and some are inherently privileged more than others. I still remember, even a few years ago, bumping into some of those people I once was alongside in that conference back in 1990. Some of those privileged white men have now become reactionary neoconservatives now, because now that suddenly we're into so-called cancel culture and white male privilege is being called into account, those same people who are radical voices on the left have now become neoconservatives on the right, because they have the power to make a choice. And the difference between being able to make a choice and having no agency, even if all of us are caught up in it at the same time, are not the same things. And so in a recent blog I've written, that we don't have to go into, this is not about me, it's about Graham's book, which is brilliant, by the way, is that diversity and liberation are not the same things. Yes, as we see with our current Conservative government, there is a whole wealth of diversity in there, but there's very little commitment to radical social justice and liberation, even from those of African and Asian descent who have been caught up in empire alongside white folk. But those are privileged voices that are as much mad in entitlement as those individuals I once saw in the conference all those years ago. So the skill of Graham's book, I think, is not just that it helps us to see things differently, it helps us to name things differently and to recognize these interlocking, intersectional forms of injustice. But also, I think, and this is a critical thing for me, is that he's able to embody a radical kind of particularity that says that our ways of being in coalition and collaborating with one another cannot come through a kind of color blindness, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya, which tends to be the kind of default position often of many of our churches, that what we try to do is to dissolve difference in order to affect a form of solidarity, which often simply reifies the power of white masculinity, white heterosexual masculinity, that still ends up being the default position that runs the world. Rather than that, what he does alternatively, I think, and very skillfully, is to say, actually, it's by attending to our particularities, just attending to the fact that there are lived stories that are embodied in different cultures and different traditions across the world. They're not equal. They never have been equal. And not all voices get heard, and not all voices are taken seriously. Not all voices are given the privilege of being listened to, and their accounts helping to shape truth. We know that most of what we say as our canon, and most of what we say as theological orthodoxy, as Graham quite rightly shows, has very little to do with a prevailing spirit of radicality, and has more to do with the power of association of who gets to speak and whose words then become canon and other people have to read them. Part of the joy of this book is hopefully that this book one day will become canon. I mean, I'm not sure that Graham as a nonconformist will thank me for saying that. But I hope that it's the kind of book that people will feel that they have to read in order to be serious about being a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. Because what it offers is another way of seeing, another way of being. To go back to that story again, it's a way of saying there is an obnoxious smell here, and we should not become habituated to it and let it settle amongst us and to be described as normal. There's nothing normal about this smell. It didn't come by accident, and the fact that we've been persuaded to live with it is actually part of the structural and systemic sin to which we all need to resist. And so, Graham, thank you for a book that enables us to resist and to do so with honesty and clarity and wit, and written in a way that is profound without being portentous or pretentious. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for the way you've rooted Graham's thinking and writing in your own experiences of the world in which we live. Thank you. Thank you. Graham, Do you want to make any brief response to Kate, to Anthony, before we have a few minutes at least?
I just briefly want to say, wow, I'm over. Thank you so much. Kate, I just love this idea of an ecology of wildness. Let's go for it. And Anthony, thank you so much. And if this book helps people to smell better, in both ways, and to work out who stinks the most, then you say it better than me.
Thank you, Graham. Yes, any comments, questions people would like to ask Graham? Reflections to offer. Now is an opportunity. Simon, thank you. Thank you, Simon. So a question around the fact that so many of what were used to identify as radical communities are not really radical anymore. How do we become radical communities, Graham?
Well, there are questions at the end of each chapter, so hopefully it needn't be an individualistic process. There is the potential there to do it in collaboration with others to explore it. But yeah, it's a problem, and there's something particular here. So I obviously come from dissenting issue too, and when I was told someone I was writing about it, he goes, "Oh, that is like your heritage." Yes, our heritage does have that anarchic tradition in it, to try to be as flat as possible, not have too many archies going on within it, but archies creep in because they are insidious, and particularly our particular sort of variant of how that happens might be because partly we see ourselves as innocent. We're not like that dirty established church, or we're not like that very hierarchical church over there, where there's something beautiful about us, and therefore the scales fall down and we don't see all the things that do appear and that creep in instead. And that even if somehow the individual church managed to be pretty good, it's still embedded in wider social structures too, and informed by them and coloured by them. So it's a constant process of discernment. And there's a term that Andrew Shanks uses, which I borrow and I think perhaps develop a little bit as well, is the idea of hosting. So no religious community is ever going to be the epitome and complete embodiments of kingdom of God. Instead, we host it in our imperfect. We muddle along. We are awkward bodies of Christ. We are not sorted. And in fact, there's something about in our being awkward, in our struggle to learn the dance moves of resurrection, in our struggle to be that which we point to. We actually capture it quite nicely. As long as we own that awkwardness and that imperfection and that struggle, and we don't pretend that it's something other than that. We don't try to make it shiny, and we don't sort of present it as an all-sorted untruth. So, and the twin aspects to that, which are in chapter something or other, there are this idea of mediating between the different voices and experience, while also agitating at the same time. And often churches tend towards one or the other. The church can often be a mediating church where we do as Anarchy said, we sort of bind together and soon come by our type. To paper over the cracks rather than agitating, but actually, I mean, other churches are so busy agitating that they don't kind of remember how to be bound together. So it's holding those two things in tension. So it's an ongoing process, as I said, we walk towards the thing that we pursue, and we stumble, and sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we can still host it, we can still witness to it, even in the smallness, fragility of all churches, and witness to something better. Thoughts? Readable. Yeah, that's great, isn't it? Yeah, I'm sure that won't be everyone's experience. I'm sure not everyone will find it readable. And I'm just really struck by what Kate said about it being disturbing too, and repulsive even. I hope you meant what I'm pointing out, rather than the assertions I make. But and what Anthony says all about idea that I'm trying to walk us through some of the things that stick. But at the same time, I hope it is hopeful, and I think what Janet's saying is to do with that. And I think what I developed in the last chapter, I did went to small things, those small buds, the small things in the cracks, the many, many acts of kindness that are also acts of defiance. They all matter. And they all add up. And I do know this idea of God's awesome weakness, which will no doubt be one part of it that some people find quite difficult to sort of make sense of, kind of fit with how they think of God. But God's awesome weakness and how it connects with chaos theory is quite interesting. And so I do think that God is more like a small butterfly than a terrifying hurricane. And so it's the small things of beauty that spark. But that is the miracle. That's where the miracle happens. So in each beautiful, wild thing that you do, you go from here. And that all witnesses to the Holy Anarchy.
the marriage of Cana, go and do as he does. Marriage of obedience.
Yes, the only qualification that Graham will say is one of the people who has some responsibility for having some oversight over me is that I'm not always very good at obedience. And so I know that, yeah, it's as simple as that, and it's as impossible at the same time, and that's the tension that we live with individually and as communities. And we don't always see that when we're being obedient, we might think we're being obedient to Jesus, but actually what we might be being obedient to is the empire. And when we're being subversive, we might think, oh, I've been told I shouldn't do this, and actually that might be the right thing to do. So that process of working out what's the simple thing to do isn't always as simple, because different parts of the church tell us it's simple in different ways, and some parts of it are wrong.
Lots of tensions. There was another person. Yes, Ed. Is that the logical outcome, Graham? The dismantling of religion and abandonment of all that's behind it?
Yes and no. So yeah, in chapter 6, I talk about this religious spiritual tension. That's it's much more popular to be spiritual than to be religious, and I think partly, but for all sorts of good reasons, because of the corruption of religion, people would reject that, but also for a reason that I have more of an issue with, which is actually a desire for innocence, a desire to sort of step out of something that demands complex conversation of us, and to live in a sort of post-religious innocence, which actually is also not innocent, because wherever we are still embedded in something. So instead, what we should have is an honest, the most possible honest sort of religion, a religion that knows its awkwardness, that still wants to be spiritual, and too often, of course, when religion does religiousness, it loses spirituality, but we can be communities that are both religious and spiritual, and so I don't think the answer to it is to ditch religion, but it's to do religion better, and that's to be more honest about our complicity in structures, more honest about our mess, more honest about the legacy of what we've done in the past. It doesn't sound very attractive, though, does it? It's kind of like, come and join us, we're a bunch of, all sorts of things. But actually, it's subversively attractive, because a community that dares to be as boldly honest while also holding those who are vulnerable because they are the done too in the world. It's a miraculous possibility. So I still believe in the possibility of religion, and there are voices from the world church that I think often speak to that more profoundly than people in the West. And actually, the religion means a great deal in other parts of the world in a way that sometimes the West has lost that sense of it. So yeah, I think we can be faithfully, honestly, complexly, spiritually religious. Yeah, of course, some people will say you need to dismantle it. All that religion is a problem. It often has been. It needs to be.
Thank you. So, a question: we can be so fearful about something as radical and as new as this. How do we share it in a way that actually does?
Thanks, Bill. That's a great thought. And I mean, in many ways, I think this is mainstream, isn't it? I mean, because it's centered on grace. It's centered on a sort of the divine love, which is expansive and that we try to contain. We edit the love of God again and again. And that's what we've seen it. It's our editing of God's love. And so rooting that in the Christian story is the celebration of the most possible, the most expansive, scandalously expansive love, which comes up against a world that is not like that. And what this love also does is it exposes the asymmetries in this world, where, as Anthony was saying, some people have more privilege than others. And again, these are things which are deeply embedded in Scripture, and God hears the cries of the oppressed, and so on. So there is both this at its heart is a commitment to the uncontainable love of God. And if parts of the church have lost sense of that, and yes, they have, then that's a problem that needs to be addressed, but you can simply call them back to that as who we are, as people of Jesus of Nazareth. But I do like it has this tension, it has the tension for love for enemies, again, pretty key thing that Jesus said, loving those who are other than us, loving those who are, loving those who disagree with us, loving those who are even against us, while also loving justice, so loving those who oppose our loving of others. And so it has this tension within it, but all these things are integral to the gospel story, it seems. But yes, the church often doesn't like the gospel story. Because it upsets Christians at least as much as it upsets people in the world. But that's how Anarchy. It is disruptive and subversive for insiders at least as much as it is outsiders. In fact, outsiders often are warmer to it.
Thank you, Graham. We restore to a close. One or two things to say before we finish. The first thing is to thank David very much for coming and to remind you of our bookstore. £15.99, and David is there. And to thank very much indeed Kate and Anthony for being with us this evening and offering their reflections and helping us enter into the world that Graham has inhabited over recent months. Let's show our appreciation.